Okay, so hi everybody. Um, so it's been great to see the doctoral consortium come together so nicely, and I'm glad now to tell you a little bit more about my own research, and in particular about discrete optimization and its use for sustainability applications, something that I feel very passionate about. So again, I guess everybody knows by now, my name is Bistra Dilkina. I'm an assistant professor in computational science and engineering at Georgia Tech. I did my PhD and postdoc at Cornell, and I was part of the first wave of PhD students to take part in establishing the field of computational sustainability. Thanks to my PhD advisor, Carla Gomez. And then that really, I started purely as a discrete optimization person who was very interested in developing scalable algorithms, but in the abstract, and then starting to work on problems that arise in conservation planning for biodiversity, opened my eyes to a totally new way of doing research that's related to real impact and to solving real problems, which gave me a lot of challenging problems and new ideas of things to work on. Okay, so what is discrete optimization? Discrete optimization is basically solving problems that involve decision variables that can take multiple discrete values, for example, a binary variable of 0, 1. Usually have an objective function that depends on these decision variables and a set of constraints that your solutions need to satisfy. So as you can see, this kind of generic description is very broad, and it can really capture a lot of things that we need to do every day, from resource allocation to achieve some task like allocating crews to flights, to scheduling buses or routing cars, etc. So most discrete optimization problems that arise in the real world are actually NP-hard, meaning that finding optimum solutions requires exponential time in the worst case. So there's no easy kind of greedy algorithms that will guarantee you finding the best solution for those problems. So if you have n variables, and each variable can take two values, either 0 and 1, then in the worst case you might need time that's proportional to 2 to the n. So you can see that with that kind of dependency, even for moderate sizes of number of variables n, you're quickly going to be outside of the scope of the time that you might want to wait for a solution, right? So that's why it's very important to design smart algorithms to try to beat that worst case complexity, right? And so one thing that people have realized is that although this worst case complexity for these NP-hard discrete optimization problems often might look like a dead end, real world problems with real world coefficients in the problems and constraints actually in practice are easier to solve than this worst case complexity. So you don't hit that bad corner of the complexity space. Okay, and also all the algorithmic developments that have gone into designing more effective and scalable algorithms has really opened up the world to actually finding optimum solutions to discrete optimization problems that involve hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of decision variables. So there's three main domains of kind of techniques for discrete optimization problem. The first one is exact algorithms. So these are algorithms that guarantee to find the optimum solutions. And there's smarter exact algorithms for problems with additional structure, something like, for example, having linear constraints and linear objectives. But those exact algorithms with optimality guarantees still, in the worst case, take exponential time because we cannot really beat this NP hardness of the problems we are solving. Then the second family of algorithms that are applied very broadly and are particularly popular in the engineering field, like basically when researchers or practitioners that have to solve some of these NP hardness problems in the wild, they usually come up with heuristic algorithms to solve their problem. So heuristic algorithms have no guarantees on optimality, but they're usually kind of pretty quick to design and pretty quick to run. And for some problems with smart heuristics, they can actually be very good at finding good solutions quickly. Right, so an example of a heuristic algorithm that is often used is simulated annealing, which is like a randomized local search algorithm, or genetic algorithms like NSGA. So, and then the third class of kind of techniques that are broadly used are approximation algorithms. So approximation algorithms are polynomial time algorithms, so very fast to run. And they have the nice property that the solutions that they find are not optimum, but you can guarantee how far away from optimum they are, right? So they have approximation or optimality guarantee in terms of a percentage away from the best possible solution. So they cannot tell you what the solution looks like, the optimum one, but they can find a solution and tell you that will not be any worse than, let's say, 30% away from the optimum value. Approximation algorithms cannot be developed for every NP-hard problem. There's a lot of NP-hard problems which are inapproximable. And so usually when you get a difficult problem, you look very hard at the structure of that problem and try to identify whether you can design an approximation algorithm that has good guarantees. Right? So one popular and effective family of problems that have a good approximation and algorithm is problems that have this submodularity property that Pradeep mentioned in his talk. Right, so if you can show that your particular problem has this submodularity objective, then you have a very quick, fast, greedy algorithm that guarantees that the solution it would find is within 63% of optimum. So that's your approximation guarantee there. Okay, so one particular very broad family of discrete optimization problem is the mixed integer linear programming family, where basically we have problems which involve both continuous and discrete variables, but we restrict somehow the description of what kind of problems it encodes. And the restriction here is that the constraints should be expressible as linear inequalities or equalities over the variables, and the objective also should be able to be expressed as a linear combination of the variables. So not every discrete optimization problem is linear, obviously, so it's a subset, but it's actually a very broad subset of discrete optimization problems. And one big part in terms of applying this mathematical modeling family is recognizing that the problem that you have at hand, that you might have described in like kind of general English description or even written down the most straightforward set of equations for it, might not look like it's linear, but then with some insight on how to linearize it or how to reformulate it, you might be able to actually place it in this mixed integer programming formulation. And what does that give you? So if you can show that your problem is actually expressible as a mixed integer linear programming, you can leverage some specialized techniques that a lot of researchers have worked over multiple decades to improve and fine-tune and make them scalable and effective. So one very effective method is the branch and bound method for mixed integer programming, which is in the family of these exact algorithms. So branch and bound is guaranteed to find the optimum solution given enough time. Again, in the worst case, it takes exponential time, but for many real-world problems, encode it as a MIP and solve it by branch and bound, we actually find solutions much quicker than that. Right? And the best thing is that there's very good commercial solvers like Ciplex and Gurobi, which can now solve problems with thousands of discrete variables in very reasonable times. And so sometimes that's kind of overlooked by people that don't actively work in the discrete optimization world. You know, they get a problem, they're like, oh, my problem is NP hard, it's too difficult, let me just design a heuristic algorithm. And they sometimes like don't even try encoding it into a MIP and running it with the solver when those solvers would have solved their thing in like very quick time. And so recently, I would say over the last 5 years, 10 years, there's been multiple examples of, you know, papers being published about these sophisticated heuristic algorithms about these complex problems, and then somebody saying, oh, well, let's just put it in the MIP solver, and then suddenly it obviates all this research because the MIP solver just like solves it in a few seconds or minutes. So one advice is, if your problem can be encoded as MIP, just plug it in and try it. And then you might need to like do some massaging to make it easier if it doesn't scale right away, but there's a lot of easy tricks. Okay, so this next family that I mentioned was the local search algorithms family. So in the local search, the broad framework of how you design a local search algorithm is to really think about your search space. Your search space is basically all possible assignments to the variables that you have in your problem, right? And so that will be all possible combinations of value assignment or all potential solutions. Within that big set of potential solutions, and again, if you have n variables and every variable can take 2 values, it's a binary variable 0, 1, that will be 2 to the n potential solutions, right? Some subset of those solutions actually satisfy your constraints, right? And so these are called the real solution set. And then you encode a neighborhood relation for your local search that basically says, if I have a solution, this complete assignment to values to my variables, how can I modify my solution to get another solution? Right? So it's a way to move from one potential solution to another. And finally, you also specify an evaluation function, which basically says, maps any potential solution to a value, right? And so this value can be directly your objective, or it can be something that is a function of your objective, but maybe also a function of whether the potential solution satisfies the constraints, how closely it is to satisfying them, etc. So all the local search algorithm designs that you can find out there can be expressed in this language of a search space, set of potential solutions, sets of real solutions, neighborhood relation, and evaluation function. So the kind of high-level framework of all these methods is that you start from some initial solution, a complete assignment, and then you iteratively move from current solution to another solution based on your neighbor relation that you defined for your local search design. And you use your evaluation function to choose among this neighboring solution. So one thing to think about the way that the local search algorithms work is that they have this myopic view of the search space. So you have like your overall search space of all potential solutions, and if you had a global view where you knew exactly how the landscape of solutions look like and what their objective is, you could pinpoint where is the global optimum, right? But you don't, and so in local search you have this, you're in a particular spot in the search space, one solution that you have in mind right now, and you have this local view of some close by solutions that are almost similar to this one and how good they are, better or worse than your current one. And you're kind of deciding how to walk in this space of potential solutions. And there's many different types of local search algorithms, things like iterative improvement types of algorithm, and a very common example is hill climbing. So in hill climbing, which is the most often used one, is basically you always choose to move to the solution that is the best among your neighbors. So you're kind of greedily climbing around, and then you get to a place where all the solutions around you look worse than you, and then that's it, you're stuck, and you return that as the solution you find. Obviously, in a very complex problem, you can have a search space which has multiple of those local hills, so that this solution which has no neighbors that are better in it can be very far away from the global optimum. Stochastic local search augments this idea with stochasticity, saying, well, this is too, you can get stuck too quickly. Obviously, this evaluation function is not perfect, so you should inject some randomness in the choices you make so that you have a chance of like escaping this local minima and finding other solutions that might be better. So you usually include some kind of stochasticity in the local search. So for example, you simulated annealing, you select a random neighbor with some decaying probability over time. Another one is taboo search, where you kind of try to structure the way that you're exploring the overall search space by remembering characteristics of solutions that you have already visited and making them taboo, saying you're not allowed to go to a solution that has that same structure, and that forces your search to go to a different part of the search space. And finally, another big family of very effective algorithms is the large neighborhood search algorithms, where it basically takes this one step further. Usually this neighboring relation used in most local searches is that you flip the value of only one variable at a time. So you're doing these very small incremental changes to your solution. But that might mean that you're kind of really slowly moving in your search space. So in the large neighborhood search, it says, well, undo a whole part of the assignments of variables and then reassign them again. So you're kind of taking away a whole component of the solution and replacing it with something else, which allows you in the search space kind of paradigm to jump very far away, right? And so how you do that, what you define as like your neighborhood, this large neighborhood is very important in deciding these methods. And finally, a big family of very effective algorithms is genetic algorithms, which are based on this idea that you don't need to have one solution at a time that you modify as you're trying to find a good solution. You can have a whole population of them. And then the way that you explore your search space is by basically evolving this population of solutions in parallel, right? And so the idea in genetic algorithms, kind of inspired by DNA and evolution, is that you have two solutions, which are like two individuals in the population, and you mate them with each other. So they do a crossover where you keep some components of one solution and some components of the other solution to generate a new solution that might be better as an offspring. Right? So these are the big families of local search algorithms. So now I want to tell you a little bit of how I use these kind of discrete optimization techniques in biodiversity conservation, which is the sustainability domain that I have done most work on. And that basically started during my PhD when I was part of the first computational sustainability expedition. So biodiversity conservation, as we've heard already in multiple talks, is a very pressing issue, and is part of one of the sustainability goals, number 15, like life on land as well as life in the oceans. And the pressing matter and challenge is that basically humans have increased species extinction rate by as much as 1,000 times over the background rates. So we're having much more species extinction than in the past. And we're having much faster human development and impacts on habitats than before. So currently 10 to 30% of mammal, birds, and amphibious species are threatened with extinction, and this number is predicted to increase rapidly in the future. So in order to kind of stop this process, we really need to actively develop methodologies to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, right? And so biodiversity conservation tries to do exactly this. Okay, so it's a key sustainability goal. However, in practice, the agencies that manage biodiversity conservation efforts often set targets or make proposals or conservation plans based on only ecological benefits, right? So they're based on the insight of biologists and ecologists about what the species need in order to survive, and they evaluate those and make recommendations. And then when when you go to the ground, now you have limited resources and you have to decide actually what to buy, right? Or how to spend the money that you have. But the recommendations that you get are kind of separated from that economic decision of what to buy and how to do it. So that disconnect actually creates big inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in using these limited resources for this important goal. Right? And so that discrepancy was actually identified in a recent report by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in 2011, where they recommended that federal agencies that implement biodiversity and ecosystem conservation programs should prioritize expenditures based on their cost effectiveness explicitly, as opposed to before it was more like, oh, let's just set targets about how much habitat for this species should be protected or what should minimum should be done for specific goals. And why this is difficult to do is because actually making recommendations and plans and strategies which optimize ecological and biodiversity benefit together with considering economic costs and budget constraints, when you put those two things together, the problems become basically discrete optimization and network design problems. And those are very challenging. And usually, you know, the people that are making these plans, they don't have the right technical background to know how to solve them effectively. And so that was kind of my motivation to really get involved and see how computer science and discrete optimization techniques can help here. So what is biodiversity conservation? A very high level, like the simplest way you can think about it is you're given a set of species to protect in a given tract of land, and you need to decide which parcels to select in order to protect. Then you have some kind of budget constraint. It can be at the number of pixels or parcels you can say protect, or an actual land cost budget. And then for each parcel or pixel in the landscape, you have some knowledge, ecological knowledge about the habitat suitability or the presence of a particular species of interest. And then you have a target for each species, right? So, so basically, mathematically, you can think of that as a set of parcels from 1 to n, the cost of each of those parcels, Ci, and a set of species from 1 to s. And then for each pixel and each species, you have a parameter AIS that tells you something about that species in that particular parcel. So how you interpret this AIS, it could be sometimes the semantics of that could be 0, 1, it's an absence or presence of the species, or it could be capturing the abundance, how many individuals of that species live there, or it could be a probability that the species is there, right? But in all cases, often in conservation, that's the kind of data that you get. Okay? So the simplest conservation problem is basically to decide how to pick which parcels to protect in order to minimize the cost of conserved pixels, ensuring that every species S is present in at least TS pixels. So TS was the target of how much habitat or how many individuals of that species you need to save. All right? So this problem can be easily expressed in mathematical terms as a minimum set covering problem, and written as a mathematical mixed integer program in these 2 lines, where you basically have one binary variable for every pixel that says it's a 0, 1 variable. It's 1 if you choose to protect it, 0 if not. And then you're minimizing the cost, which is the sum of CI times XI, so you pay only for the ones that you choose to protect. And there's the constraints that basically say sum up all the abundances or presences in the pixels that you have set to 1, that you have chosen to protect, such that their total sum is greater than this target TSI. Right? And so you can obviously add a lot of things to this simple formulation. Ecologists care about, let's say, boundary of the reserves. If you're protecting some land and then the part of the land that is abutting non-conserved land is less effective because there can be people that come in and disturb the habitat, etc. So you might want to minimize the boundary of the conserved, overall conserved land, etc. And a lot of these things can actually still be encoded as linear constraints. So one thing, back to this discrepancy between practitioner solutions and what's used in practice versus what you might be able to do. Mathematically, one of the most often used tools by ecologists and conservation practitioners is called Markson. It's kind of state-of-the-art for conservation practitioners, and it solves exactly this problem, this minimum set covering problem, which is very kind of easy to formulate as a problem, yet Markson actually implements simulated annealing, which is a heuristic local search that's not guaranteed to find optimum solutions. And actually, in a very recent paper just published last year, some of the people from the ecology community that actually have used Markson for a decade in all the papers that have published now implemented this set covering part in a MIP model and ran it with one of those state-of-the-art solvers, Gurobi, and realized that the solutions that they've been using from Markson were actually like 50% away from optimum. So a lot of these recommendations that have been done in ecology journal papers were really based on solutions that were very far away from the best that they could have done with the budgets that they were considering. So that was kind of like very disappointing for them, very kind of, I don't know what to say, reassuring for me as somebody who is like been pushing this agenda of really using computational techniques and mathematical techniques to solve these problems optimally. So the other way that you can reformulate this problem, so you have this cost and this ecological benefit. So one can be placed as a constraint, the other one as an objective, or you can flip them. So if you flip them, it's what's called the maximum coverage problem, where you basically have a budget, the cost as a budget constraint. So you want to buy parcels or pixels within some budget B. And now what you're trying to do is you're going to maximize how many species meet their target constraint, right? So it's the same problem, except we've flipped what's going to be a hard constraint and what's going to be objective. So to do that, you need some extra variables. You basically, in addition to the X variables that keep track of which pixels you're buying, you also have these Y variables which keep track of whether you've satisfied the target for your species or not. And so with that variable in hand, you can express a constraint that says Y can be 1 only if the target is met, and then you put Y in your objective that says maximize the number of species that have met their target. So that's kind of the other way you can think about this equivalent problem. And in fact, again, the other big software tool used by conservation practitioners called Zonation solves exactly this problem, like this flip problem of maximum coverage. And unfortunately, in Zonation, again, they actually solve this problem with a heuristic algorithm. And here they have actually chosen to do like a greedy algorithm which removes pixels or parcels first that hurt the objective the least, right? So they keep on removing parcels that are like not contributing to meeting the targets or marginally contributing to meeting the targets until what they're left with is only parcels that fit within their budget, and then they stop. Right? And then that's the solution they give back. And again, this greedy algorithm, heuristic algorithm, has no optimality guarantees and is often very, very far away from the best that you can do, especially when you have additional constraints. Okay, so Markson and Zonation, highly scalable. The good thing about them being implemented as heuristic algorithms is that you can easily plug in all sorts of additional constraints without having to think about whether they are, it can be expressed as linear inequalities or not. And so kind of from modeling perspective, it's easy to add on stuff, but cannot enforce, all of them cannot enforce the constraints strictly. So basically what happens is for both of those algorithms, you have to kind of give a penalty for breaking the constraints, and so you're actually not even guaranteed that the final solution that the algorithm provides even satisfies all your constraints, right? And there's no optimality guarantees. And in addition, now when you want to add additional things like spatial considerations, you might want to conserve pixels that are close to each other so that you minimize these boundary effects. Or more recently, people have started thinking about connectivity. You want the overall set of pixels to actually form a connected component so that the individuals in these reserve areas can interact with each other and have genetic exchange so that there is no inbreeding. These problems become even harder and more interesting from computational perspective as well. So as I said, one of the big considerations that people have, ecologists and conservationists have really started to pay attention to is connectivity as another very important goal of conservation outcomes. So because of mostly anthropogenic effect, there has been a lot of habitat loss, but also there's been a lot of fragmentation from that loss. So due to things like urbanization, deforestation, and agriculture, we are losing habitat, but we're also losing the habitat all over the place. So what happens is that the remaining habitat for species is kind of in patches isolated from each other. right? And so what they've realized is that conserving just these kind of islands of good habitat will be not good enough in the long run, because these local populations are too small. There's going to be inbreeding. Because of climate change, the conditions might change, that even those areas are no longer the right habitat. The temperature and precipitation needed for the species have shifted to another place, so they actually need to change their range. And so because of that, they have emphasized the need to pay attention to landscape connectivity when conserving land. You want to conserve not only good patches of habitat, but you also want to conserve the links between them to allow for these genetic exchanges as well as adjustment to climate change or dispersal needs or fire events, etc. So how ecologists are modeling this landscape connectivity, they think about the landscape as a set of pixels, and with each pixel there is associated a value called resistance. Resistance is basically how difficult it is for the species to move through that particular pixel and the habitat that they encounter there. So for different species, different things make it difficult to move. For some, it's the slope. For others, it's the elevation. For third, it might be how urbanized that pixel is, etc. So basically, there's a whole bunch of ecological modeling that goes behind this to basically, for each species, learn a model of which features, landscape features are important, and how to express this resistance value for each pixel based on the landscape characteristics. But then you can think of like, okay, so that modeling is done, and now I get this landscape characterized by these resistance values for each pixel for the specific species that I have in mind. Now within that, how do I measure connectivity? So the way that connectivity is measured is basically, if you want to say what is the distance, connectivity distance between two locations on the landscape, it's what is the shortest path between those two locations based on the resistance along that path. So it's not the Euclidean distance, but it's actually the cumulative resistance along all the pixels that you need to cross. Okay? So that's kind of the working definition for landscape connectivity for species. And so based on that definition, you can identify basically what are the shortest resistance paths for the species between habitat patches that are already protected. So on the right here, you can see this connectivity plan done for California, where in green are things that are intact or protected areas, and in yellow are these areas of low resistance path that are likely for the animals to use. So this analysis is done exactly from this perspective of only looking at what are the ecologically best areas for connectivity, right? So these yellow areas are the shortest resistance paths for this particular animal they were looking at, and so this kind of map is then becomes the kind of base for all the decision making that is done later. So it's used to prioritize conservation decisions, to make recommendations, etc. Well, one thing to notice about this map is that it says nothing about the cost of protecting those yellow areas, right? In particular, there could be multiple shortest paths, and some of them might be much cheaper than others. Right? But there's no way to know that information from this. So having decision making based only on information about what's the ecologically best plan, which would be protect those yellow areas, which are like the perfectly shortest resistance corridors for this species, is very limited and can lead to high inefficiency in this cost effectiveness that was highlighted in the report I told you about. Okay? So this problem of wildlife corridor conservation planning has become like a major problem that I have worked on. And so the idea is to really explicitly link core biological areas. So you have a limited budget. You actually incorporate and consider the cost of the parcels. You want to buy a set of parcels that ensures that there's a path connecting each pair of core areas that you're given. Minimizing the resistance of those corridors, so you want them to be effective ecologically for the species, but the total cost of the corridors that you propose must fit within the budget given the costs, right? So once you put both of those considerations, economic and ecological, together, this is actually an NP-hard problem, and so you need some sophisticated algorithms to solve it. But allowing with those algorithms in hand, what you can do is you can have a systematic analysis of the cost effectiveness of plans, right? As you change the budget, you can see what is the marginal benefit in connectivity that you can get. Another thing that people have raised within that framework is that you might want to have more than one corridor per pair of core areas to provide some robustness. And finally, you might actually also consider planning not for only a single species, but multiple species, which might have some partially overlapping requirements. And you might be able to achieve some economies of scale by joining the decision-making for both. And so this is a problem that we have worked on. And so we call it a robust budget constrained corridor design. So abstractly, you can think of this problem as you're given a landscape of cells or parcels. Again, every cell has a resistance, every cell has a cost, and you have pairs of core areas that you want to connect and a budget, right? And you have to find a set of parcels to protect such that the set of parcels that you've protected form disjoint paths that connect, form K paths for each pair of core areas. So in the simplest way, you require one path for every pair of core areas, but you might require more if you want some robustness. And the total cost of all the pixels that you've protected doesn't exceed your budget, right? And so these are meeting these hard constraints of connectivity. You have to have the paths and of the budget. And your objective is to minimize the resistance along those paths that you've protected. So that will basically translate into these corridors are good or easy for the species to use. So that's your ecological objective. Okay, so this can actually easily be transformed into a graph optimization problem where you think of this landscape as a graph where each pixel is replaced by a node, and every two adjacent pixels are connected by edges, right? So you can move from one directly to the other. And now you basically associate the resistances and the costs as attributes to your graph nodes. And you have, again, your budget and your connectivity constraints. So once you do that transformation, this actually falls into a very broad family of network design problems that a lot of people in computer science and operations research have worked on, called Steiner Network design problems. That basically you can think of this problem as a graph problem with these costs and node delays, and these core areas that you're trying to connect as your terminal nodes. That's the language being used in the Steiner Network literature. So once we made this connection between, the abstract, nice CS problems and the problem we are working on, that gave us a lot of ideas of techniques, but we also realized that this particular problem, Steiner Network design problem, really hasn't been solved before. So again, the real world imposes constraints that other people might not have thought about in other applications, right? So in particular, we have this kind of delay minimization, which corresponds to the resistance minimization. And so one cool thing about this is now we are going to design a methodology that solves this problem, but because we have abstracted it to this general Steiner network problem, you can think of other applications that might have the same kind of structural constraints. And we actually easily came up with a couple of other things, other settings where you might have the same kind of delay minimization objective subject to cost constraints. So for example, in things like chip design, where you want to have minimize the delay along critical paths of, as you go from transistor to transistor that identify like input and outputs for running things on the chip. Okay, so this is an NP-hard problem, and so what we did is basically translate this into a mixed integer program. And so one thing to realize is that although our constraints are formulated in this kind of, in a sense, declarative way where we are saying, well, we need to make sure that the pixels we are selecting provide at least one path between the core areas. So how can you do that? How can you verify that this constraint is satisfied? Well, you can run like a shortest path algorithm on your graph to find out that there is a path and what its length is. And so that will be kind of verifying this constraint in a algorithmic way. But instead, what I'm going to show is that you can also express that constraint as a set of linear inequalities that do the same, enforce that same connectivity. And so so we have these decision variables, which are one binary variable per parcel, 0 if we're not buying it, 1 if we're buying it. The budget constraint is obviously linear, so Ci times Xi, Cv times Xv over all variables should be less than B. And then this transformation about the connectivity constraint into set of inequality constraints. So that's like a classical textbook transformation where we can encode the existence of a path between two nodes in a network by a set of flow constraints. So you can think of this, of your network of nodes and edges as a set of pipes, okay? And so you're pushing one unit of flow from one node across these pipes or edges in your network, and this unit of flow can only go out of the system through the other endpoint, the other point that you're trying to connect to, which is called the sink, right? So I'm trying to connect two nodes S and T. I'm going to treat one of them as a source of one unit of flow and the other one as the sink of this one unit of flow. And so I'm going to create these continuous variables, flow variables for every edge for the particular pair I'm trying to connect, and impose a set of linear constraints. The first two easy constraints are that only the source node S can spew this flow out, one unit of flow, and only the sink can take this flow in, and all the other nodes in the graph, whatever comes into those nodes in terms of flow has to be equal to what comes out along the edges from that node, right? So there's this flow conservation constraint that just says incoming values of these flow variables, their sum has to be equal to the sum of the outgoing flow variables. And finally, in order to actually impose the constraint of, well, this path has to fall only within the parcels that we've actually decided to buy, that translates into a constraint which says incoming edges of a node can carry flow only if that node is purchased, right? So we're not going to allow that flow to go through nodes that have not been purchased, meaning that if we can actually find a way to push that unit of flow from the source to the sink, that means we've gone only through nodes that we have bought, right? And essentially that guarantees that there is a path within our reserved network that connects those two pairs of nodes that we care about. Yep. Okay, the projector needs a break. My time is not up, right? Oh my God, we started late, so yeah, I have only 10 minutes. So I'm going to continue talking, otherwise I'm going to lose 2 minutes. Have to wait for the projector to restart, shut down and restart. And so that's basically, and then the objective is just the resistance along these pathways that this flow takes within the conserved network. Okay, so this problem, again, we showed already that it's NP-hard. Now we have shown that we can encode it as this mixed integer linear program, which allows us to then use these state-of-the-art commercial solvers in order to solve pretty large-scale problems. So here, really, the big thing is really, first of all, realizing that you can translate the problem, the high-level connectivity conservation problem, really into this mixed integer linear programming paradigm. So that's the first thing to think about when you're given a discrete optimization problem. Is there a way to linearize it, right? And so then you can try these solvers right away. And so we actually applied this mixed integer linear programming formulation to a real conservation study with my collaborators from the U.S. Forest Service, the USGS, as well as Oregon State University. That was like a 2-year project where we really worked hard in getting real data compiled in order to actually see how this works in practice. And we applied this to two keystone species in the area of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, the grizzly bear and the wolverine. So both of those are species of interest that have declining populations that they are very interested in conserving. And so the model that I described so far was really focusing on one species, and now we'll show you how basically it's very easy to extend this to consider two species at a time by, in a sense, duplicating the model, like putting two sets of resistances and two sets of evaluations in terms of the two objectives, which will become the connectivity provided for each of the species, the grizzlies and the wolverines. It's going to take 1 minute for it to start. So to do this modeling, we basically got data on the resistance values for grizzlies and the core areas that where current grizzly bear populations exist, and similarly resistance values for the wolverines and their also core areas of where they exist, and finally a characterization of the cost of different parcels along across our study area. So you can see here the maps, and you can see that they're quite different. Basically, the two species have different habitat requirements. Their nodes are different, and their resistances are different. And also the costs, the economic costs across the landscape is obviously very heterogeneous. And that's a very big importance, because if you have uniform costs, then ignoring those costs might not have such a big impact of what the best solutions are. But when you have very heterogeneous costs, then the incorporating those upfront in your decision making becomes very, very important, right? Because you might have some pathways which are much cheaper and maybe have some only slightly worse connectivity benefits. Okay. So now that we have these two species, what we'll do is just extend the model to consider both connectivity, the connectivity requirements for both, and we're going to trade off between the two of them by combining them with different weight parameters. And so because these resistances are on vastly different scales, what we do is we first normalize them by just computing what is the best resistance that we can find for each of the species separately within the budget, and then we consider for any proposed solution what is the resistance provided for grizzlies, normalized by the best possible for the grizzlies, versus the connectivity provided for the wolverines, RW, normalized by that, and weighted by alpha and 1 minus alpha, right? And varying this alpha parameter will let us explore different solutions based on how much importance is given to grizzlies versus wolverine by the conservation agency, okay? So now that we have this MIP in mind, we can actually do this systematic cost-effective analysis, which is very empowering for these decision makers. We can find trivially and easily the ecologically best connectivity, which is the green triangle on the bottom, very low resistance, meaning very good connectivity for both species. And that's what your connectivity plans would look like without this optimization. Similarly, we can actually find what is the economically cheapest way to connect them without considering resistances. So just make sure there is a path, but don't worry about how bad the path is. So that's achievable only within 3 million, but the resistance of those paths is very bad because it passes through areas that are really not good habitat for these species, versus the best ecologically ones are 32 million. So that's a whole order of magnitude difference. And now with our MIP approach, we can find solutions for something intermediate, like for 4 million, which is only slightly above the cheapest possible, and yet it gets us all the way pretty close to the best connectivities that we could provide. So from 32 million to 4 million, we save a lot of money, and yet the resistances deteriorate only a very little. And this curve is the curve that we obtain by varying alpha, showing the trade-offs between the two species as you vary their importance. And then you can solve this for different budget levels, where the shift in that curve will give the decision makers the idea of how much marginal benefit in connectivity they get from increasing the budget from, let's say, 3.5 million to 4 to 4.5 million. And you can see that as you go higher in budget, the marginal benefits become smaller and smaller. So at some point you might say, okay, good enough, right? So this is extremely empowering, and yet it provided a new computational graph optimization problem that falls in a family that's of high interest to the CS community and yet had not been specifically modeled or solved before. Now, when we try to do this on an even larger scale, or even on the same area but for smaller pixels, then at some point this MIP approach starts to have a hard time. Right? So this is already scaling to tens of thousands of decisions, but if we want to do like hundreds of thousands of decisions, where sometimes conservationists really want to model decision making on like a 100-meter by 100-meter decision making, so that makes the problem very hard because the pixels are so small. Then we have to think about local search approaches because the MIP approach cannot go that high, right? And so we proposed also a local search approach which scales to those very large problems. And the idea was that we're going to leverage this large neighborhood search idea. And so what we did here is basically, again, propose how are we going to undo part of the solution and replace it with with a different part in our local search update of the solution methodology. And this definition of what components to undo and redo with the large neighborhood part is really the design part of making this algorithm work effectively or not work effectively. So here, this neighborhood that we defined was basically looking at the current solution and finding out, breaking it down between like components of paths. So here you can see that every node that has degree of 3 or more becomes like a intersection nodes, and then which connects to other intersection nodes by only nodes of degree 2, which are just this pathway, right? So then that's a component that our large neighborhood search is going to undo and redo, right? So we're going to strategically take out a whole path and replace it. And we can still use our MIP encoding by basically saying, how are we going to replace that path that we just undid? Well, finding the base replacement for that path is like a mini corridor design problem, which means we can use our MIP to try to actually optimally replace it, right? So it's a local search algorithm, but it still leverages the MIP encoding to find good moves in the local search space. And so that provided really fast solutions. Again, it doesn't have any optimality guarantees, and the bigger the budget becomes, the more suboptimum the solutions that this algorithm produced. So I am like severely over time for some reason. I think we started very late. Huh?
We take after your advisory.
I'll take that as a compliment. Yes. So there's a lot of other network design. I'm going to wrap up. There's a lot of other network design problems. I wanted to tell you about something related to network diffusion, because that was something that we saw with a lot of the posters earlier today. But in conservation planning, you also have network diffusion when you think about dispersal of species. And we worked on that problem as well, and basically found a way to encode this problem also as a network design MIP problem, together with a sample average approximation on top of it, which basically deals with the fact that diffusion is stochastic, so you have to consider multiple samples of possible diffusions. And anyway, so you can treat that as a cascade, which is something that computer scientists have worked on a lot in social network domains. And so we designed this methodology based on sample average approximation and showed that our MIP-based solution with optimality guarantees provides much better solutions than this greedy heuristic approach that our partners were using to make their decision making until then. Okay, and so again, the nice part, just the highlight that I want to give here is that we started with a specific problem of saving this red-cockaded woodpecker, working with a conservation fund. But when we abstracted the problem and found a solution to it, we also realized that the underlying problem is very general and has many other applications, in particular many other sustainability-related applications like epidemiology, contamination of water networks, invasive species, power outages, etc. And the underlying problem is to create scalable algorithms for this diffusion-aware optimization of network topology. So we want to change the topology in a way that minimizes or maximizing some kind of stochastic diffusion problem. And so the work that we did for the species translates to a general framework that works for independent cascades, which is one type of diffusion. But later on, we also worked on a different diffusion model called the linear threshold model. And there we actually found very good additional structure in the problem, in particular submodularity that I already mentioned. And so we could design actually very fast algorithms with approximation guarantees. So some research challenges in this field: very large-scale NP-hard network design problems that can be encoded with MIPS, but they're still often very large. And so it's very important to work on the algorithmic improvements to make branch and bound algorithms for MIPS more scalable and effective. The other thing from the conservation perspective is that ideally what you want is you want to go beyond this one-shot planning. Decisions for conservation are made over time. There's dynamic prices, there's stochastic events, so you want to be able to solve these problems as dynamic, stochastic, sequential decision-making problems, right? And so hopefully the tutorial that comes right after me is going to give us some ideas of how to do this. In terms of improving MIP branch and bound, Elias already showed the poster yesterday. We've been doing a lot of very interesting work on combining machine learning in order to improve exactly optimization techniques that will work on the problems that I'm trying to solve in conservation planning. And we have some very good results on that. And so, in conclusion, just wanted to highlight the fact that this two-way street that also Carla mentioned between us trying to solve real problems, but then getting back problems that are really interesting from computational perspective and that have multiple applications across different domains, and being able to publish in both words, conservation and CS. So, thank you.